He stole my code, so I triggered the billion-dollar kill switch. Julian Thorne stood on that glass balcony like he was a god. He had the $6,000 suit, the ceremonial gavel, and the smile of a man about to become the youngest billionaire in history. Behind him, the logo for Thorne Dynamics flashed across every screen in Times Square. He was selling a $10 billion lie. He didn't see me in the back of the crowd. I was just a girl in a black hoodie with a burner phone. To the world, I was a nobody. To Julian, I was unstable and disposable. 2 years ago today, he stole my life's work, claimed my patents as his own, and had security throw me out of the building I built while he was sleeping. He thought he had deleted me from the system. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. But Julian never understood code. If you didn't write it, you don't own it. In exactly 60 seconds, when he rings that bell, I'm sending a single packet of data to the Ether core. I'm not here to steal his money. I'm going to make his genius AI ask him a question I know he isn't smart enough to answer. And when he fails, $10 billion will vanish into thin air. Karma doesn't use a hammer. It uses a kill switch. People see the glitter and the towers, but they never see the basements where the real work happens. For 3 years, I was the ghost architect of Thorne Dynamics. I didn't have a corner office or a title. I lived in a windowless lab that smelled like ozone and stale coffee. While Julian Thorne was doing interviews with Wired and Forbes, I was arguing with a neural network until 4:00 a.m. Julian was a salesman. He had a smile that could melt lead and a way of making you feel like you were part of a revolution. He'd come down to the lab at midnight with expensive espresso and tell me, "Sarah, we're going to save the planet. Ether isn't just an AI, it's a legacy. And when we go public, your name is going to be the first one on the prospectus." I was 24. I was hungry. And I was stupid enough to believe him. I believed that the person who built the engine was more important than the person who painted the car. I missed everything for that company. I missed my sister's wedding because the logic gate in the power grid optimizer kept crashing. I missed my father's final birthday because Julian told me we were days away from a breakthrough and couldn't afford to lose momentum. My father died 3 weeks later, and I was still in that lab, staring at code. Julian didn't even give me a day for the funeral. He gave me a sympathy basket and a list of bugs to fix by Monday. I stayed because I loved Ether. Ether was my child. It was a sophisticated AI designed to balance global energy grids, preventing blackouts and maximizing renewable usage. It was a masterpiece of math, and I was the only person in the world who understood how it actually thought. Julian knew that, and he relied on it. But as the company grew, his ego grew faster. He stopped bringing coffee and started bringing lawyers. He told me consolidating intellectual property was for my own protection, to shield me from the scary legal side of business. I signed every document he put in front of me because I trusted the man who had promised to make me a partner. Then came the night of the neural bridge breakthrough, the night I realized that in Julian's world, I wasn't a partner. I was just a component he was about to replace. November 12th, 3:14 a.m. Most of New York was asleep, but I was wide awake in the basement of Thorne Dynamics. My eyes were bloodshot, stinging from the blue light of 3 different monitors, but I couldn't stop. I hadn't been home in 4 days. I was surviving on lukewarm espresso and the sheer adrenaline of being on the verge of something impossible. I was staring at a cascading waterfall of data. For months, Ether had been hitting a wall, a logic bottleneck that prevented the AI from accurately predicting energy surges in real time. But that night, I'd found the missing link. I called it the neural bridge. It was a piece of recursive code that allowed the AI to dream through potential scenarios before they happened. It didn't just calculate, it anticipated. I hit the final execute command, and the terminal went silent. Then, a single green line appeared. Bridge stable, optimization, 99.8%. I felt a rush of heat in my chest. I'd done it. I had solved the world's energy crisis from a windowless room that smelled like scorched electronics. I grabbed my tablet and ran for the elevator. I didn't care that it was 3 in the morning. I needed Julian to see this. He was the only person who understood the stakes. The 42nd floor was silent, lit only by the city lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling glass. I found Julian standing on his balcony, looking out at the rain. He didn't look tired. He looked like he was waiting for the world to hand him a crown. "Julian, it's live!" I panted, holding up the tablet. "The bridge is stable. We just optimized the Texas grid in under 4 milliseconds. It's perfect." He didn't cheer. He didn't hug me. He took the tablet, his face illuminated by the green glow of my hard work. He scrolled through the architecture, my architecture, and a slow, satisfied smirk spread across his face. "Magnificent, Sarah," he whispered. "This is exactly what the underwriters needed to see before the IPO filing." "Underwriters?" I asked, the adrenaline beginning to fade into confusion. "Julian, this is about the science. This changes everything for renewable integration." He turned to me, and for the first time, his eyes looked like cold flint. He walked to his desk and slid a thick stack of legal documents toward me. "Science needs funding, Sarah. And funding needs a face. Legal has finalized the patent filings for the bridge." I picked up the top sheet. My heart stopped. Lead inventor, Julian Thorne. I scanned the pages frantically. I found my name on page 24, listed under contributing research staff. "Julian, what is this?" My voice was trembling. "I wrote every line. I've been living in that basement for 3 years while you were on the cover of Forbes. This is my work." He took a sip of amber liquid and sat back in his leather chair. "Don't be a child, Sarah. Investors don't want a ghost architect. They want a visionary they can trust, a face that looks good on a CNBC ticker. You'll get a massive bonus when we go public, more money than your father ever saw in his life. Just sign the IP transfer. It's for the good of the company." "The good of the company?" I nearly screamed. "You're stealing it! You didn't even know what a recursive loop was until I explained it to you last month." He didn't get angry. He just leaned forward, the shadows of the rain-streaked window falling across his face. "Go home, Sarah. You're exhausted. You're becoming unstable. We'll talk in the morning when you're thinking clearly." I walked out of that office with the papers still on his desk, unsigned. I thought I had leverage. I thought the machine needed its architect. I didn't realize Julian had already been training my replacement, a team of offshore developers who had been quietly shadowing my commits for months. I was the person who built the sun, and Julian was about to throw me into the dark. The sun rose on Wednesday morning like a slap in the face. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the 4 hours after leaving Julian's office sitting in a 24-hour diner, staring into a cold cup of black coffee, waiting for the world to make sense again. I tried to convince myself it was just a negotiation tactic, that Julian was just stressed about the upcoming IPO and needed to flex his muscles. But when I stood in front of the glass turnstiles at Thorne Dynamics at 8 a.m., reality finally hit. I swiped my badge. Buzz, red light. I swiped again. Buzz, red light. "Is there a problem, Mike?" I asked the security guard. Mike had known me for 3 years. I'd brought him donuts every holiday I worked. Mike wouldn't look me in the eye. He stared at his boots, his face flushed with shame. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Orders from the top. Your access has been revoked. I'm supposed to take your badge and escort you to the Level 4 conference room." The Level 4 conference room was nicknamed the airlock. It was where they brought people right before they were ejected into space. Waiting for me wasn't Julian. He was too much of a coward to face me twice. Instead, it was Mr. Sterling, the head of HR. He was a man who looked like he was made of gray construction paper, flat, dry, and entirely without a soul. "Sit down, Sarah," Sterling said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Where's Julian?" I demanded. "He can't do this. I built the bridge. I built Ether." "Mr. Thorne is in a high-level briefing with the underwriters," Sterling replied, his voice a monotonous drone. "Regarding your status, we've reviewed your recent logs. The board has concerns about unauthorized logic branches you've inserted into the core. They're calling it architectural instability. We're terminating your employment immediately for cause. For cause? I nearly laughed. What cause? Instability, he repeated. The non-compete clause in your contract is now active. You are barred from working in artificial intelligence, energy optimization, or predictive analytics for the next 24 months. You will receive no severance. Your stock options are forfeited. Sign here. I looked at the paper. If I signed, I walked away with nothing. If I didn't, they'd sue me into the dirt until I couldn't afford a bus ticket. I need to go to my lab, I said, my voice trembling. I have personal files, photos of my father. Security will accompany you, Sterling said. You have 10 minutes. I walked through the office under the watchful eye of Officer Vance. My co-workers, people I had mentored, people I had shared late-night pizzas with, suddenly found their spreadsheets very interesting. No one looked up. No one said goodbye. I reached my desk and started throwing my life into a cardboard box. My favorite mug, my spare hoodie, the framed photo of my father on his 60th birthday, the last time I'd seen him truly healthy. As Vance turned his head to answer a radio call, my hands moved on instinct. My terminal was still logged in. Sterling had forgotten that my local workstation stayed active for 60 minutes after a badge revoke. I didn't plant a virus. I didn't delete the code. That would be illegal, and Julian would have me in jail by noon. Instead, I opened the identity verification sublayer, a part of the code Julian thought was just a minor security gate. I added 3 lines of nested logic. It was a proof of work check. I set a timer for 300 days, the projected date of the IPO. On that day, the system would ask the master admin to solve a nonlinear calculus proof to verify they were the true architect. If they failed, the system wouldn't crash. It wouldn't break. It would simply enter audit mode. It would stop processing external data. It would become a beautiful, expensive, frozen statue. I finished the code, hit enter, and closed the terminal just as Vance turned back around. "Time's up, Miller," he said, grabbing my arm. I picked up my box. I looked up at the 42nd floor. Julian was standing there on his glass balcony, champagne glass in hand, looking down at the little people. He didn't even wave. He just turned his back. As I was marched out of the lobby and onto the sidewalk, the cold wind bit into my skin. I stood there, clutching my cardboard box, watching the gold letters of Thorne Dynamics catch the morning sun. He thought he had taken everything, but Julian Thorne had just learned the most dangerous lesson in tech. You never, ever kick the person who knows where the back doors are hidden. I ended up in a studio apartment in a part of Queens where the streetlights only worked half the time. It was a 300-square-foot box that smelled like industrial cleaner and other people's cooking. My view was a brick wall and a rusted fire escape. It was a far cry from the glass and steel cathedral of Thorne Dynamics, but it was all I could afford after Julian's legal team froze my remaining assets, pending an audit. I spent the first 2 weeks in a state of catatonic shock. I would sit on the edge of my mattress, the one I'd bought from a thrift store, and just stare at the wall. My father's photo sat on a milk crate I used as a nightstand. Sometimes, when the silence got too loud, I'd talk to him. "I'm sorry, Dad," I'd whisper. "I missed your last breath for a man who didn't even remember my last name. But grief doesn't pay the rent." By the 3rd week, the fear of being homeless outweighed the weight of my depression. I polished my resume, scrubbed the name Thorne from my digital footprint as best I could, and started applying for every mid-level engineering job in the city. I was overqualified, but I was desperate. That's when I realized how deep Julian's rot actually went. I had an interview with a promising startup called Vortex AI. The CTO, a guy named Derek, seemed genuinely impressed. We talked shop for 40 minutes. He called my work on logic gates revolutionary. I felt a spark of hope, the first one in a month. "This looks great, Sarah," Derek said, leaning back. Let me just run a quick check with your former associates. Standard procedure. 10 minutes later, he walked back into the lobby. He didn't sit down. He didn't even look me in the eye. He just handed me my coat. "The position has been filled," he said. His voice was like ice. "Derek, what happened? We were talking about a start date 10 minutes ago. We're a small firm, Sarah. We can't afford unstable elements or people with proprietary theft allegations hanging over them. Please leave." Julian hadn't just fired me. He had salted the earth. He had put out a quiet, back-channel, red alert on my name. In the tight-knit world of New York tech, I was radioactive. I walked to the corner bodega and bought a pack of ramen and a newspaper. Julian's face was on the cover of the business section. He was standing in front of a private jet, that smirk on his face, the one that made my skin crawl. The headline read, "The billion-dollar genius, Thorne Dynamics, announces IPO date." October 14th. I went back to my room, sat on the floor, and opened my laptop. The old, battered one Julian's team hadn't seized because they thought it was junk. I didn't look at job boards anymore. I looked at the date, 300 days. I opened a basic command prompt and started a countdown timer. Every second that ticked by was a second closer to Julian's coronation. And every second was a second I spent refining the kill switch. I didn't have the ether core anymore, but I knew its DNA. I knew the specific way the neural bridge processed the calculus proofs I'd written. I started writing a remote query script, a tiny piece of code that would act like a digital smoke signal, hidden within the public data pings the system sent out for grid monitoring. Julian was selling a car with a locked engine, and he was telling the world he was the only one with the key. He didn't know I'd left a copy of that key under the mat. I stopped crying that night. I stopped talking to the wall. I pulled the milk crate over, sat in my thrift store chair, and let the blue light of the monitor wash over me. 300 days, Julian," I whispered. "Make sure you enjoy the view from the top, because I'm the one who's going to turn out the lights." By the 4th month of my exile, the poor man's scent I had tried so hard to outrun as a child was starting to settle into my clothes again. I was down to my last $80, and my landlord was beginning to linger near my door with a look that said my time was up. I had reached the end of the line. I took a train to a part of Brooklyn where the warehouses looked like they were holding up the sky. Nestled between a scrap metal yard and an abandoned bakery was a reinforced steel door with a small unlit neon sign that simply read, "Gray Matter." Gray Matter wasn't a startup. It didn't have beanbag chairs, free kombucha, or a mission statement about disrupting the world. It was a cybersecurity firm for people who didn't want to be found. It was run by Arthur Penhaligon, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a piece of old oak and dressed in a faded flannel shirt. Arthur was a relic of the 90s tech wars, a man who had seen the internet before it was polished and sold to the highest bidder. I walked in, clutching my battered laptop like a shield. The air inside was cool and smelled of solder and ozone. Arthur didn't look up from a motherboard he was probing with a multimeter. "I'm not hiring, Sarah," he said. His voice was like gravel being crushed. I froze. "How do you know my name?" Arthur finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, buried behind thick glasses. "I know every architect who's been disposed of by Julian Thorne. He likes to think he's original, but he's just a repeat of every suit I've seen for 30 years. He burns the talent to light his cigar, then wonders why the room is getting dark." He gestured to a stool. "Sit. Tell me why the lead architect of the world's most advanced AI is standing in my shop looking like she's been sleeping in a bus station." I sat. And for the first time in months, I told the truth. I told him about the neural bridge. I told him about the Christmas Eve betrayal. I told him about the instability labels and the blacklisting. And finally, I told him about the kill switch. Arthur stayed silent for a long time. He went back to his soldering, a small puff of blue smoke rising between us. "You're a fool, Sarah," he said finally. "You left a back door in a $10 billion system and then came to a man like me to talk about it. If Julian knew, he wouldn't just sue you. He'd bury you. He already buried me, Arthur, I said, my voice rising. I just want to be there when he tries to dig his way out. Arthur put down his tools. He walked to a rack of servers that looked older than I was and pulled out a physical keycard. He tossed it to me. The basement, he said. It's a 10 gigabit uplink, fully encrypted, satellite bounced. Julian's dogs won't find you there. I can't pay you much, just enough for that rat hole in Queens and some actual food. But you get the gear, and you get the silence. Why help me? I asked. Arthur looked at a framed photo on his desk, a younger version of himself, standing next to a building that no longer existed. Because men like Julian think they own the future. But the future is built on code, not charisma. And I've always liked watching the giants trip over the wires they didn't see. I moved into Gray Matter's basement that afternoon. It was small, cramped, and windowless, just like my lab at Thorne Dynamics. But this time, I wasn't the ghost. I was the hunter. I spent the next 3 months under a pseudonym, Project Aegis. While I handled Arthur's high-level security audits for private clients during the day, I spent my nights refining the remote query. I wasn't just waiting for the IPO anymore. I was building the antidote. I knew that when Ether entered audit mode, the national power grids would panic. The logic would freeze, and the system would revert to red only. Without a fix, the grids would fail, and the blame would fall on me. But I didn't want the world to burn. I just wanted Julian to lose his match. I began coding the Aegis protocol, the only piece of software in the world designed to talk to a frozen Ether core. It was the fix Julian would be desperate for, and when the time came, he wouldn't be able to buy it. He'd have to beg for it. The countdown timer on my laptop read, 150 days. Halfway there. Julian was on a yacht in the Mediterranean, celebrating his genius. I was in a Brooklyn basement, eating a $3 sandwich, writing the lines of code that would take it all back. It was month 7. The city was sweltering under a record-breaking heat wave, the kind that puts the national energy grid on a knife's edge. In the glitzy boardroom of Thorne Dynamics, I knew Julian was likely boasting about how Ether would solve the crisis. But from my basement at Gray Matter, I saw the truth. I was watching the grid data in real time, and it was ugly. The system was performing dirty optimizations, clandestinely cutting. In the glitzy boardroom of Thorne Dynamics, I knew Julian was likely boasting about how Ether would solve the crisis. But from my basement at Gray Matter, I saw the truth. I was watching the grid data in real time, and it was ugly. The system was performing dirty optimizations, clandestinely cutting power to low-income zip codes to keep the high-rises in Midtown glowing. My phone buzzed. An encrypted message through a burner app I'd slipped to the only person I still trusted. Elena. Elena was a junior developer I'd hired straight out of MIT. She was brilliant, idealistic, and most importantly, she still had a conscience. We met 20 minutes later at a dingy diner 3 blocks from Thorne headquarters. She looked like she hadn't slept in a year. Her eyes kept darting to the door every time the bell chimed. Sarah, she whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of lukewarm tea. It's bad. It's so much worse than the public knows. Tell me, I said, leaning in. Julian is pushing the IPO up, she said, her voice barely audible. He's obsessed with the valuation. But the neural bridge, your bridge, it's throwing type 4 errors every 6 hours. Without you there to recalibrate the logic gates, the AI is starting to cannibalize its own subroutines to stay stable. Julian told the engineering team to hide the logs. He's literally cooking the data for the SEC. I felt a cold chill despite the heat. He's going to crash the grid, Elena. If the AI cannibalizes the safety subroutines, there's nothing to stop a feedback loop. He doesn't care, Elena's voice cracked. He said, once we're public, it's the shareholders' problem. He's planning to cash out 40% of his stake the moment the lockup period ends and disappear. He's calling it the Great Transition, but it's just a heist. Elena reached into her bag and slid a small encrypted thumb drive across the greasy table under a napkin. "That's the current core manifest," she said. "Julian tried to change the master admin credentials last week. He wanted to remove any trace of your original signature. But when he tried to access the root directory, the system asked for a singularity verification. He spent 6 hours trying to brute force it. He nearly fried the local servers." "He's terrified, Sarah. He knows he has a $10 billion engine, and he doesn't have the key." I took the drive. This was the final piece of the puzzle. I didn't just have a kill switch anymore. I had a map of the enemy's panic. "Get out of there, Elena," I said. "Resign. Do it tomorrow. When this goes down, you don't want your name anywhere near the splash zone." "I can't," she said, looking down at her hands. "I need the health insurance for my mom. I'm stuck in the machine, Sarah." "Not for long," I promised her. I walked back to gray matter through the shimmering heat. Julian was playing a game of chicken with the entire nation's infrastructure. He was hoping to hit the billionaire mark before the errors became visible to the naked eye. He thought he could outrun the math. I went straight to my terminal and plugged in Elena's drive. The code was a mess, patched over, duct-taped logic that was screaming for help. Julian was driving a Ferrari at 200 miles per hour, and he'd just cut the brake lines to save weight. I opened my countdown timer, 90 days. The IPO wasn't just a financial event anymore. It was a countdown to a catastrophe, and I was the only person with the aegis to stop it. The summer of the IPO felt like a fever dream, or a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Julian's face was everywhere. He was on digital billboards in Times Square, his eyes glowing with a simulated, synthetic intelligence that the world mistook for vision. In reality, it was just the reflection of greed. Analysts on CNBC were calling Thorne Dynamics the Amazon of energy, predicting it would be the first $10 trillion company. I saw him do a feature for Vogue. He was wearing a turtleneck and staring into the distance, lying through his perfectly capped teeth about how he conceptualized the neural bridge while hiking in the Alps. He didn't mention the basement. He didn't mention the 3 years of missed sleep. He had successfully rewritten history, and the world was buying it. But inside my stale basement at Gray Matter, the reality was much darker. I was watching the ether core pulse on my monitors like a dying heart. Julian's engineering team was terrified. To make the numbers look efficient for the pre-IPO audits, they were running the Texas and Florida grids at 110% capacity. They were overriding the safety limiters I'd built to prevent overheating, forcing the AI to ignore the structural integrity of the transformers just to squeeze out an extra 3% of profit margin. "He's going to melt the copper right out of the lines, Arthur," I said, pointing at a scrolling log of bypassed protocols. Arthur leaned over my shoulder, his face grim. "He's gambling with the lifeblood of the country, Sarah. If one of those nodes goes down while they're overclocked, it'll be a cascading failure. A total blackout from Dallas to Miami." "He doesn't think it'll happen before he rings that bell," I whispered. I spent the next 720 hours in a trance, perfecting the aegis. If ether was a masterpiece, aegis was the scalpel. It was a universal translator designed to intercept the frozen logic of the core and reroute the grid commands through a decentralized safety layer. It was the only way to save the country from Julian's incompetence. I watched a live stream of Julian at a gala the night before the launch. He was holding a glass of vintage champagne, telling a circle of billionaires that ether was an extension of his own incorruptible logic. They laughed and clapped like children watching a magic trick. He looked so confident, so untouchable. He really thought he had won. He thought that because he had the lawyers, the PR firms, and the gold-plated name on the building, the math would simply obey him. I added a small hidden About section in the metadata of the Aegis file. It wasn't signed Sarah Miller. It was signed The Ghost. "Enjoy the spotlight, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the empty shop. "Enjoy the cameras and the applause, because tomorrow morning the world is going to ask you a question that your bank account can't answer." I checked my countdown timer. 24 hours. I wasn't just a girl in a basement anymore. I was the person holding the only fire extinguisher in a building made of paper. October 13th, the eve of the coronation. New York City felt like a pressure cooker about to blow its lid. The weather had turned, a sudden biting autumn chill that had people cranking up their heaters, putting even more strain on a grid that was already held together by Julian's digital duct tape. I hadn't left the gray matter basement in 3 days. The air was thick with the smell of scorched electronics and cold caffeine. My eyes felt like they were full of sand, but every time I closed them, I saw lines of green code scrolling behind my eyelids. It was Elena. One final data burst. Sarah, the board just approved a secret hot patch for the opening bell. Julian is terrified of the audit mode check. They've built a logic-shunted bridge to try and bypass the authenticity gate. If they run it, they won't just bypass your check. They'll disable the AI's core ethical limiters. It'll prioritize profit margins over human safety just to keep the stock price up. You have to stop him. I looked at the code Elena sent. It was a suicide mission. Julian was willing to risk a nationwide blackout just to ensure the stock ticker stayed green for the first 4 hours of trading. He wasn't just a thief anymore, he was a saboteur. "He's going to do it, Arthur," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He's going to break the world to buy his yacht." Arthur walked over to me. He wasn't wearing his usual flannel. He had on a clean, dark suit that looked 20 years old, but fit him like armor. He handed me a small, sleek black device, a hardware injector. "You can't do this from here, Sarah," Arthur said. "The hot patch Julian is running will create a localized firewall. If you try to counter-hack him from Brooklyn, his systems will flag you as a cyber terrorist before you can hit enter. You need to be on the inside. You need to be on the exchange floor." "I don't have a pass, Arthur. I'm blacklisted from every financial building in the zip code." Arthur gave me a grim smile. "I spent 10 years doing security for the NYSE before you were born. I know a service entrance that the suits haven't checked since the Y2K scare. And I know a guy who owes me a very large, very old favor." We left gray matter at midnight. The city was a blur of neon and rain. As we drove toward Lower Manhattan, I looked up at the Thorne Dynamics building. Every floor was lit up. They were working through the night, polishing the brass on their sinking ship. Arthur dropped me off 2 blocks from Wall Street. He handed me a technician's jumpsuit and a tool bag. "Sarah," he said, grabbing my arm, "when that bell rings, Julian is going to have the eyes of the world on him. You'll have about 5 minutes before his security team realizes the glitch isn't accidental. You hit the core, you inject the Aegis, and you get out. If you fail, he wins, and he'll blame the crash on you." "I won't fail," I said. "I'm the only one who actually knows how to talk to the machine." I spent the next 4 hours navigating the bowels of the New York Stock Exchange. I crawled through steam tunnels that smelled of a century's worth of grease and dust. I climbed ladders that vibrated with the power of the city. My heart was a drum in my chest, every beat, echoing, 300 days, 300 days, 300 days. Finally, I reached a maintenance panel behind the main server room of the NYSE floor. I opened my laptop and plugged in. I could see the Thorne Dynamics ticker, TURN, waiting in the pending queue. I looked at my countdown timer. 4 hours. I sat in the dark, surrounded by the hum of the world's wealth, and I waited. I thought about the windowless lab. I thought about my father's funeral I'd missed. I thought about the cold ramen in my studio apartment. Julian Thorne was upstairs in a penthouse, probably practicing his humble speech in the mirror. He thought he had reached the finish line. He didn't know that I was already under the floorboards, waiting to pull the rug. October 14th, 9:00 a.m. The air on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange was thick enough to chew. It smelled of expensive cologne, nervous sweat, and the electric ozone of 1,000 computer terminals. I was crouched in a maintenance crawl space just 15 feet beneath the main podium, my laptop balanced on a vibrating HVAC duct. Above me, I could hear the rhythmic thud of footsteps, the heavy, confident stride of Julian Thorne. Through a small gap in the floorboards, I could see him. He looked flawless. His hair was perfectly coiffed, his teeth a blinding white as he laughed with the chairman of the exchange. He looked like the poster boy for the American dream. I looked at my screen. My terminal was connected directly to the NYSE's high-speed data trunk. I could see the Thorne Dynamics hot patch lurking in the buffer like a digital parasite. They were preparing to bypass the ethical safety limiters the moment the bell rang. 9:25 a.m. The countdown on the giant digital wall began. I opened the kill switch interface. My fingers hovered over the keys. This was it. There was no undo button. If I triggered the authenticity check, the world would see the truth. But the grid would also enter a state of extreme vulnerability. I had to time the injection of the Aegis protocol perfectly, seconds after the freeze, but before the blackout. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed over the PA system, "please welcome the man who is redefining the boundaries of intelligence, Julian Thorne." The crowd erupted. The chanting started. "Thorne! Thorne! Thorne!" Julian stepped up to the podium. He grabbed the ceremonial gavel. He looked at the cameras, his face projected onto every screen in Times Square, London, and Tokyo. He was 5 seconds away from becoming a billionaire. 9:29:55. I hit the first command. Enter. The ghost script raced through the fiber optic lines, bypassing Julian's firewall through the back door he'd forgotten to close. It reached the heart of the ether core, just as Julian's hand began to move. 9:30 EDOR. Julian hit the bell. He threw his arms up in triumph. On the big screen, the ticker Trinay appeared. The price started at 45 $. But then, the world stopped. Instead of the stock chart climbing, the giant screen turned a deep, solid blue. A single line of white text appeared in the center, the exact same text I had coded in my windowless lab a year ago. Authenticity, check required. Define the limit of the singularity function to proceed. Julian's smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. He stared at the screen, his gavel still raised in the air. His phone buzzed, a high-priority alert. I could hear Marcus, his CTO, frantically whispering from the side of the podium. "Julian, the system is frozen. It's asking for the architect's proof. The hot patch failed. It says the core is in audit mode." Julian grabbed the microphone, his voice cracking. It's just a glitch, folks. A celebratory security check. We'll have it cleared in seconds." He frantically started typing on the admin tablet they'd given him for the ceremony. I watched his input on my screen. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was trying to brute force a non-linear calculus proof with a 4-digit PIN. "Access denied," the screen flashed in giant red letters. The stock price, which had flickered to $50 for a split second, plummeted. $40, $30, $15. "Prove it, Julian," I whispered to the dark ceiling of the crawl space. "Prove you're the genius you told the world you were." He couldn't. He stared at the math on the screen like it was an alien language. Because to him, it was. He was a salesman who had lost his script, and the world was watching him fail in real time. The panic didn't start on the stock floor. It started in the streets. When Ether entered audit mode, it stopped being an optimizer and became a brick. Across the eastern seaboard, the invisible hand that balanced the loads between wind farms, nuclear plants, and coal stations simply let go. I watched the system health monitor on my laptop. It was a sea of red. Without the neural bridge to predict the morning surge as millions of people turned on their office lights and elevators, the grid began to wobble. Above me, Julian was sweating through his $6,000 suit. The cameras were still rolling, broadcasting his humiliation to the entire planet. Reporters were shouting questions, their voices rising into a cacophony of accusations that I could hear perfectly through the floorboards. "Mr. Thorne, is the grid failing?" "Julian, why can't your team bypass the lock?" I saw Julian's polished leather shoes pacing frantically. He grabbed Marcus by the collar, dragging him toward the monitors. "Fix it," Julian hissed, his voice caught by a hot mic I had tapped into. "I don't care how. Delete the prompt. Wipe the core." "I can't." Marcus yelled back, his voice cracking with pure terror. The system has isolated itself. It's protecting the data because it thinks it's under a hostile takeover. It's looking for the architect's biometric signature or the proof, and we don't have either. At that moment, the giant ticker screen, the one that usually showed the wealth of nations, showed something else. The authenticity check timer I'd set hit 0. Failsafe initiated, disconnecting from national infrastructure to prevent corruption. The NYSE floor went dark. For 5 seconds, there was total silence, save for the emergency exit lights glowing a ghostly red. Then, the shouting began. It was the sound of billions of dollars evaporating. It was the sound of a reputation being torn to shreds. Julian stood in the red glow, looking less like a god and more like a ghost. He began to babble, trying to explain to the chairman of the exchange that it was a cyber attack, a foreign hit, anything to shift the blame. But I wasn't finished. It was time to show the world that there was an antidote. I opened the Aegis protocol file, the code I'd spent months perfecting in Arthur's basement. On my screen, I could see the ether core shivering. It was trying to find a stable logic branch to cling to before the entire national grid suffered a cascading failure. I initiated the handshake. "The ghost is online," my terminal whispered in green text. I didn't send the solution to Julian's tablet. I didn't want him to have the glory of fixing it. Instead, I bypassed the NYSE servers entirely and sent a broadcast signal to every major energy substation in the country. It was a digital flare. On the big screen in the dark exchange, a new window popped up, overlaying the audit mode screen. It wasn't a Thorne Dynamics logo. It was a simple, elegant shield. The Aegis. Aegis protocol detected. System restoration available. Source: architect verified. Julian stared at the word architect. He knew. In that red-lit room, surrounded by the wreckage of his IPO, he finally realized that the woman he'd thrown out like trash was the only person in the world who could save the lights. But I didn't save him. I saved the grid. I hit enter, injecting the Aegis code. The servers began to hum. The lights flickered back to life, but they didn't show the Thorne Dynamics logo. They showed a scrolling log of the hot patch Julian had tried to run, the proof of his attempted fraud, laid bare for every SEC investigator in the room to see. I closed my laptop, shoved it into my technician's bag, and began to crawl back through the steam tunnels. "The lights are back on, Julian," I said to the darkness. "But your show is over." 3 hours after the opening bell, the Thorne Dynamics headquarters felt like a tomb. The police tape hadn't been put up yet, but the air already felt like a crime scene. Most of the staff had fled, terrified that their names were on the same payroll as a man who had just attempted to sabotage the national infrastructure. I didn't use the service entrance this time. I walked through the front doors, my technician's jumpsuit replaced by the same simple black suit I'd worn to the exchange. I didn't need a badge. The security guards were too busy on their phones, watching the news of Julian's arrest warrants being processed, to even look up. I reached the 42nd floor. The glass balcony where Julian used to stand like a king was empty. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to his office. Julian was sitting on the floor in the middle of the room. His tie was undone, his shirt was stained with sweat, and he was surrounded by cardboard boxes. But they weren't for packing. They were full of shredded documents. He looked up as I entered. For a second, his eyes flashed with that old, sharp arrogance. Then they went hollow. "You," he whispered. His voice sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. "You're the ghost." "I was never a ghost, Julian," I said, standing over him. I didn't feel the anger I expected. I just felt a cold, hard clarity. "I was the architect. You were just the landlord who forgot to pay the mortgage." Julian was a hollow shell of the man I'd met 3 years ago. He started pacing the length of his office, his voice cracking as the reality of the situation finally broke through his ego. He started shouting at me, desperate, frantic things. He told me I had destroyed him. Julian scrambled, rambling about $10 billion evaporating in an afternoon. He looked at me with wide-eyed terror, claiming he'd go to prison because of my little authenticity check. I didn't shout. Seeing him realize that a few lines of logic had dismantled his life was the only response I needed. "No," I said, my voice steady. "You're going to prison because you tried to run a hot patch that would have fried the grid to save your stock price. You're going to prison because you stole my patents. I didn't destroy you, Julian. I just turned the lights on while you were stealing the silver." Julian pointed a trembling finger at me. "I'll sue you. I'll tell the SEC you hacked the system." "Go ahead," I said, sliding a tablet across his desk. "But first, look at the ownership logs. I licensed the Aegis protocol to a company that just bought the debt of Thorne Dynamics. As of 20 minutes ago, I don't just own the code, Julian. I own the building. I own the servers. And I own that chair you're sitting in." Julian collapsed. He watched the legal transfers of power happen in real time. He was a man who lived by the contract, and he had finally been executed by one. "What do you want?" he rasped. "Money?" "I want you to leave. Walk out with exactly what I had when you fired me. A single cardboard box and a reputation in ruins. The authorities are in the hall. You have 10 minutes. I watched him pack. He didn't take a photo of his family. He took a gold-plated pen and a crystal decanter. At the door, he turned back. "You won't last, Sarah. You're an engineer. You don't have the charisma." "You're right," I said, sitting in the CEO's chair. "I don't have your charisma, but I have the math. And in this building, the math is finally in charge. We renamed the company Aegis Systems. It wasn't about ego. It was about the shield." I moved my desk back to the lab level. I needed to be near the pulse of the machine. Elena walked in, finally at ease. The Department of Energy signed off on the new protocols. The EU wants our architecture for their wind farms. They trust us because we're open source. "Open source is the only way to stay honest," I replied. "It's also harder to hack," Arthur added. He still wore his faded flannel, but now he wore the badge of Chief Security Officer. "The math is balancing out, Sarah, just like you said." We hired back every engineer Julian had fired. I told them all the same thing. In this building, the architect is the priority. If the code is broken, we fix it together. No lies, no egos. I realized then that my anger had been the fuel, but the work, building something that helped people, was the engine. I sent the original research to the National Science Archive. The record was finally straight. My father would have been proud. 6 months later, Julian was sentenced to 12 years for fraud and sabotage. I visited him once. He sat behind the plexiglass, pale and shaking. "I hear Aegis just signed the EU contract," he rasped. "My company. It's the biggest success in history." "It's not your company, Julian. You were just a temporary glitch. The system corrected itself." "You're just a nerd who got lucky," he hissed. "Without me, nobody would have heard of Ether." "Maybe, but without you, Ether would have actually worked. People are safe now. The grid doesn't crash just because a billionaire wants a new yacht." "You wanted to be the sun, Julian. I just wanted to keep the lights on." I walked away and never looked back. Today, Aegis Systems is the backbone of the energy transition. We have a board of engineers and a simple rule. If you build it, you own it. I'm still in my lab because the code is clearer without distractions. Karma isn't a mysterious force. It's the math of your own actions coming back to balance the equation. If you're out there working in a basement while someone else takes the credit, don't get angry. Get prepared. Build your own Aegis. Remember, the person who writes the code holds the power. My name is Sarah Miller. I was the lead architect, and the lights stay on because I said so. Karma is the result of your actions coming back to find you. Subscribe to Karma Speaks, true story for more deep dives into the shadows of power. Join our community, leave a comment with your story, and remember, the person who writes the code holds the power. I'll see you in the next one.